Hello, everybody. Thank you very much for coming along. It's been a very interesting conference so far. I hope you'll agree. I listened to what William Hague said. I thought it was very interesting, and it touched on quite a few things we're going to discuss here in this session, which is the working title is Volatility versus Efficiency: Managing Global Supply Chains. But supply chains are front and centre of nearly everything that's happening at the moment, from COVID to ships parking themselves sideways in the Suez Canal, to Ukraine, to virtually everything else. And it has been a game changer, not only for manufacturing, but certainly for manufacturing especially. Just one technical thing, this gives me the opportunity to actually repeat the most famous broadcast by one of my old friends, Brian Hanrahan, the late Brian Hanrahan, who, when he said, in the Falklands War, I can't tell you how many planes took part in the raid, but I counted them all out and I counted them all back in again. The technology wasn't working to scan you on the way in, but it will scan you on the way out. So we don't know how many are here yet, but we will when you leave. Okay. Very glad that you come along for this briefing, this discussion. We basically are going to base it around a report called Operating Without Borders, Building Global Resilient Supply Chains, which is out on the 15th or the 16th, I think, isn't
16th.
it? 16th. So we will make lots of references to it, but we won't give away quite the key findings. It was done in conjunction with Infor, which is why we have David Threlfall there. But also I'm joined by Andrew Kinder from Infor, sorry, it's very rude of me. Fergus McReynolds from Make UK, he's the EU and international affairs expert who will be talking about the results. And then we have an example of a startup, a British Volt, which you will all have heard of, involved in making batteries to put into the new generation of cars. And so we have experts from Make UK, from the software side of information technology, which is helping manufacturing, and from a manufacturer itself, for your delectation. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask Fergus, first of all, to spend a couple of minutes taking us through the headlines of the report, which I have actually read. It's in my bag. You can't have it yet, but it is very interesting. Thank you.
John T, thank you very much, and good afternoon to everyone. I think probably where I will start is reflecting a little bit on the last couple of years and the impact that some of the significant changes we've seen in the UK's place in the world, and what impact we have seen from that on supply chains. But I think everyone in this room will know manufacturing supply chains are extraordinarily complex, extremely integrated, but also extraordinarily resilient. And what we've seen in the last 2 years are two of probably the most fundamental impacts that certainly I have seen in terms of manufacturing supply chains. One, which was probably a little predictable, and one that certainly wasn't. And that's the pandemic and the UK's fundamental change of its trading relationship with the exit from the EU and the establishment of a new trading order for the UK. These two things are the things which have been highlighted by manufacturers as the most significant impacts on their supply chains. However, what we have seen from that volatility is not, unfortunately, something which is new. We've experienced over the last 30 or 40 years, since the establishment of some of our global trading rule mechanisms through the GATS and most recently with the establishment of the WTO, a globalization which has benefited manufacturers, created global supply chains, created options to look at alternative supplies, developed a just-in-time supply chain, and we saw international trade coupled with GDP growth globally. As one increased, the other increased. Actually, the last decade has seen an uncoupling of those two things. And it's not just the pandemic, it's not just the UK's exit from the EU. We've seen a real stagnation in that link between growth and resilience in supply chains. Some of that has been from national policies, and we certainly saw a proliferation of national approaches to trade. We've seen, to some extent, a real challenge to the WTO mechanism, and really starting to see that friction in global supply chains become a bit more of the normal rather than the exceptional. And that decade of volatility appears to be something which is setting in. So one of the things that we've explored in the report is trying to understand that link between efficiency in supply chains and how we can run our supply chains extraordinarily efficiently, but is that efficiency at the loss of the resilience? And that's a really interesting thing that we're starting to see, is that we're starting to see a rub between those two things. And actually, with increasing volatility, which now seems to be setting in as a long-term or at least medium-term trend, that actually do we need to rethink how we manage our supply chains. The great news is, and as you all in this room will know, you are doing it already. Manufacturers do have complex supply chains. Well over half of manufacturers have over 50 suppliers in their supply chain, and many have considerably more than that. We are starting to see a shift in the pattern of supply chains. We're seeing some nearshoring, so not necessarily reshoring of supply to the UK, but certainly bringing supply chains closer. We're also seeing that companies are investing in technology, looking at how we can understand how technology can help us manage that resilience and manage that volatility. So hopefully what we'll discuss throughout the course of the session today is some of those increasing trends, trying to understand how manufacturers are managing that, and we'll learn from those in the business of some of the good things, but unfortunately some of the things which haven't worked as well. John T, thanks very much.
Thank you. Thanks, Fergus. Just to say that when it comes to questions, which we hope you all will join in, because we need as many questions as possible, you can do it in the room. There are microphones that will be brought to you. When you catch my eye, just say who you are before you ask your question, just so we know it for the record. But also, we do have Slido, which uses the hashtag MakeUK2022 as the kind of password. So you can either do that and put your questions in there, and they'll be sent to me on this laptop, or if you're listening at home or on Twitter or whatever, you can do that as well, and just send some questions, and they will arrive and get exactly the same chance of being used. Okay, so having done that kind of thing, Andrew, the kind of your company, software, manufacturing, and so on, you were behind this report. You were just telling me before that it actually coincided very well with a smaller one you'd done earlier, which really pleased you. Could you just give us some kind of background on what you found and what the key points were?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, and good afternoon, everyone. For those people who don't know Infor, we are a technology company, so we provide a lot of the manufacturing and supply chain solutions that manufacturers like yourself use, and that's why we've been interested in supporting Make UK over, probably the past decade. I think you've probably seen us turning up here every year or so. This year, there were two topics that dominated our customers' conversations. One was sustainability, leave that to one side. The other one has been supply chain. And for me, I went to an event, I'm going to say it was about 9 months ago, so some of you may have been to this event. I'm just going to say it's a manufacturer event. And we ran a series of roundtables on supply chain. I've got a supply chain background, so I ran those roundtables. And I said to Fergus when we were doing this, frankly, I was a bit shocked at what I was hearing from the roundtables. Almost everybody, and these were large companies, small companies, they were complaining about supplier reliability, that people just not delivering on time. They couldn't be sure when they were going to get their deliveries. They were even competing whether I'm going to sell to you or not. A lot of demand volatility. And during the course of that day, I started to question some of the thinking and the concepts that I've always held dear. You know, I mean, I grew up on lean, as I'm sure all of you did, and JIT, and, you know, single sourcing or careful dual sourcing or, you know, careful offshoring. And all of a sudden, everything was being questioned. So when I was relaying some of this to Fergus, who was putting together this particular survey, it made sense to kind of combine some of that thinking into the survey. And what I like about the way that Make UK have done this, for me anyway, it's the biggest, I think, the biggest post-COVID survey of UK manufacturers, and a lot of the findings that have come out of it, as you say, I think they complement some of those early findings I was getting from messages we were hearing from the customers and from the market about 9 months ago. So hopefully we'll explore some of those things this afternoon.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Finally, we're just going to hear from David Threlfall, who... well done. Thank you. I knew I was going to second over that one. Who is here from British Vault. You will all be devastated to hear that we were supposed to be having Hotel Chocolat. but they couldn't make it. They sent their apologies, but they didn't send any chocolate. So we'll have to go with what we got. But talking about cutting-edge technology, new manufacturing, and so on, and supply issues is basically what David is here to talk about.
Hi, everyone. So I'm the CIO at British Volt. And for those of you expecting Frank Gallagher from Shameless, I apologise. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, Google my name. You won't get me. So British Volt we're pre-revenue. We are a scale-up. We've moved past startup. And we have the objective of building the UK's first full-cycle gigaplant manufacturing lithium-ion initially batteries for the UK EV market, electric vehicle market. The site we've selected is in the northeast of England, and it is 93 hectares, so it will be the 4th largest ever construction in the UK. And we're about to announce plans for a second, actually, even before we started the first, in Canada, and also a scale-up manufacturing plant in the Midlands in the UK. So it's a really interesting topic around the global supply chain, because we are right in the middle of it. Our raison d'etre is to create a battery manufacturing industry in the UK to save our vehicle manufacturing business, right? Remember, rules of origin, I won't say the B word, but, rules of origin state that, batteries and electric vehicles have to be 55% of value homegrown. So when we get to 2027, if EV manufacturers are buying in Chinese batteries, for instance, because of the percentage of value to the car, it becomes a Chinese car. So the bottom line is, quite frankly, if we don't start manufacturing batteries at scale in the UK, the auto industry will leave to where the batteries are manufactured. So that's our position. And as I say, we're pre-revenue, so we're building everything, creating everything. So that's a massive challenge, but it's also a massive opportunity. And I think we're going to talk about what we're actually doing about mitigating some of our supply chain or potential supply chain issues further down the track. Okay.
So just on the rules of origin thing, this is rather like putting an axe together in the UK and claiming it's a British axe, isn't it? The battery is what percentage of the cost of an electric car?
Well, compared to a petrol or a diesel car, which is around about, the powertrain is around about 35% of the car, an EV, you're talking 75% of the value.
So you will lose the manufacturing industry without that?
We will lose the manufacturing industry in the UK.
Okay. So first, I think probably I'll ask Fergus a question first, which is, do we think that this is a temporary problem caused by lots of issues arriving all at the same time, and we should all relax a bit and wait for the global supply network to start working again, or do we panic and start spending money?
Don't want to panic anyone, but I think that we are in a situation where some of the issues are acute and they are temporary, but some of the issues are medium to long term. The change in relationship with our key trading partner is going to have a medium and long-term impact on both our ability to supply them, but also our ability to get supplies from them. So that is something which is likely to be a medium to long-term impact. Part of the challenge I think we have at the moment is that there are a number of things which are stacking up, which are temporary and may reverse. A long debate about whether we will see production of semiconductors, for instance, very topical at the moment, recover. And different administrations have different approaches to that. The EU thinks that this is a long-term problem, and they are going to fund production. The US think that this is a medium-term problem, and they're going to secure supply. And the UK thinks that this is a short-term problem, and that supply will return to the market. So there are lots of people who are looking at the market and are not sure where they are. What I think is definitely true is that the trend is towards more volatility. And that's something which I think is setting in right now to be a long-term issue. So it may not be that today's problem is going to be tomorrow's problem, but there will be a problem tomorrow. And that's what we're starting to see increasingly. And if we look a little bit further out, thinking about where we are in a global supply chain at the moment. The survey was conducted before the invasion of Ukraine, so we don't have any of the impacts of that, but you are tracking that as Make UK, working with our members to understand that. And that's clearly an issue which is certainly short-term, but is likely to have long-term impacts. On the other hand, it is also driving behaviour which is different in terms of cooperation between countries. The fact that the UK and the EU are cooperating extraordinarily well on sanctions and on understanding the impact of that is positive. But looking a little bit further down the line, are we likely to have that relationship while there's still political tensions between us and the EU? Are we going to have that difficulty with a very friendly US administration at the moment, which may not be a friendly administration in 2 years' time, with the return of potentially Trump or a Trump-like candidate that might again throw a spanner in the works of the international trade regime? So I think that there are today acute problems which are affecting certain industries, but that long-term trend feels at the moment towards more volatility, and that actually we need to manage that first and foremost.
Excellent. Thank you. Andrew, I mean, looking at some of the results in the survey, which we probably can't give away, but it does hint strongly that companies are already making these decisions, increasing the number of British suppliers, increasing suppliers in nearby countries or countries they trust. Is that right?
Yeah, and we see that from our customer base as well, in terms of, when we poll them about changes that are taking place, strategic changes taking place in their supply chain, then we're hearing the same thing. Now, interestingly, we're a global company, so we hear and we get to see different pictures around the world. So the US, I would say, are moving at that at a stronger clip, or at least that's how it feels to us. But here in the UK, yes, there's definitely more conversation about, I would call it nearshoring rather than farshoring. I mean, the obvious things that started that were the transportation challenges, the capacity challenges that we could see, both in terms of cost but also capacity. But also, coming back to what I said earlier on about these supply chain concepts being challenged, anything that you think of in terms of supply chains, whether it be JIT or whether it be lean, it's all about squeezing inventory out and getting to minimum waste anyway, not just inventory, but minimum waste. But it all pretty much depends on a certain amount of predictability and reliability. You take predictability and reliability away, it crumbles pretty fast. So I heard somebody else, I think they referred to it last year, this term started to be banded around called VUCA, volatility, uncertainty, ambiguity and complexity, I think, and those are the four letters. And it felt like we were in that permanently. And somebody had said, should we ever even expect a decade of stability ever again? And in fact, I think William Hague was pretty much saying the same thing this morning. So if that is the case, then maybe what we're trying to build is not a efficient supply chain where everything is predictable and stable and runs well with reliability. You're actually building something with a lot more resilience in it. So in other words, adaptability to change. So because where we come from that is thinking about, well, there's obviously physical things that you need to do or can do, but there's also technology things that you need to do or can do. And we apply our thinking to some extent. How do we help manufacturers and listen to manufacturers to what they think they need to run a more resilient supply chain technologically? So that's how we, that's our perspective, if you like, on supply chain change in the world.
Thank you. I mean, David, you haven't actually built your factory yet, but no. Are you worrying about where you're going to get your components from already?
Well, we are very conscious of not only the raw materials we need to source. Those materials are under increasing demand. They also come from quite a long way away, most of them. We have to make sure that we source them. We have a very strong ESG agenda. I know everybody says that, but we actually doing something about that. And part of as I see it from CIO, I see the strategic relationships building, and that's been a definite strategy at British Volt. From the very start, we were going to, and we still are, on the Gigaplant, allocated quite a lot of acreage to a supplier park, so we can bring our immediate supply chain nearer. but it's gone to another stage now. So last year, British Volt announced a long-term strategic partnership with the second largest mining company in the world, Glencore. At the same time, we joined the Cobalt Fair Alliance because we wanted to make sure that the cobalt that is being mined in those Congolese provinces were being done, without slavery, without child labour. So we wanted to have an impact on that. Sourcing, having guarantee of source of cobalt is extremely important to the battery industry. And recently we also announced a joint venture with VKTR. I always forget which way the letters go. They're an Indonesian nickel refinery. So we're the first company to build a relationship out there with these companies. So I definitely see that as a trend, strategic relationships, and it's also, working with our potential customers as well around product development. So it's obviously is transactional, it will be transactional, but it's much more of a hand-in-hand develop product together, hand-in-hand, make sure we're sourcing product in the right way.
Okay. Now we have a first question on which has come in on Slido, but it ties in with something I was going to mention. I remember when I was at the BBC, we had these off-the-record briefings quite regularly, about once a week, with very bad sandwiches and very nice people who came in and spent lunch with us. And we had one from a very large car manufacturer, which I still can't tell you because it was all off the record, but basically said, thing about Brexit is we have a just-in-time manufacturing system. If there are problems at the border, we have to build a warehouse. And it's 50 million for the land, and it's 50 million for the warehouse, and it's 200 million for the technology in the warehouse, and it's 50 million a year to run, and it's £1 billion of capital in parts. And he said, we can afford that, but the trouble is all the other BMW plants don't have to bother. So when it comes to allocating the next model, they will be cheaper than us. And this is the threat of Brexit. So the question is, how significant do you feel leaving the single market and the customs union has been when talking about global supply chain problems? Fergus, I think this is probably your area to start with this.
Absolutely. I'll give the game away a little bit in the survey on this one. The pandemic was the most significant impact on supply chains the manufacturers reported. The UK's exit from the EU was the second biggest impact, and many of them said it had been critical to their business. So I think it has had a huge impact. What we're starting to see emerging is that there are some short-term challenges which some companies have overcome. We're starting to see some predictability return to the supply chain. So you can tell your suppliers or you can tell your customers how long something's going to take, and you know how much it's going to cost. But the reality is it takes longer and it costs more. But you do have predictability, so you can start to build that into your supply chain. But for some, the relationship doesn't work. The model just doesn't work. If you have a distribution model, you're not going to be able to bring in product from outside of either the UK or the EU and then sell it equally in both of those markets. You'll have to run those as two different supply chains. So for those businesses, there is a real challenge. For some businesses, we're starting to see some of the friction at the border recede, but for others, they've taken a step out of the market. There is enough economic analysis out there to suggest that this is turning into a medium-term challenge, and the figures tend to be between 10 and 15% drop in trade between the UK and the EU. Now, what accounts for that? Some of that is the businesses that have decided to stop trading. But what we see is that where you have established relationships, European and UK partners have tended to be able to overcome them. What we're seeing is actually a natural attrition, and getting new business is a real challenge. And part of that is the actual change in the relationship, but part of that is also perception. Those in the European market think it's more difficult to do business with the UK than it actually is. So we do need to overcome some of that perception. But I think it's unfair to say that it's not an impact. We have to say it's part of the impact. And it will change fundamentally for some businesses their entire business model.
Andrew, do you see this as a factor? I mean, with the companies you talk to, are they asking you for help in these kind of areas?
The obvious thing was just on the reporting side, but that's relatively straightforward to change. It was more, I would say where we saw it most was in the time, the expectation of time on deliveries. So that affects people's visibility of their supply chain and when things are due to come in or go out. So I think that was kind of the biggest thing. And the other thing that comes up for those people who are using their supply chains or their application systems in the cloud is data residency. So now they want the data to be in the UK. If it's in the defence industry, for sure, because it's a legal compliant. But I suspect, and we're having this conversation internally in our own organisation, I don't think there will be any business that doesn't want data residency. So my view, and I'm on the strategy team, but my view pushing it internally is, I think everybody will want the security of local residency. At the moment, you don't have to unless you're in defence, so you'll accept if you've got data spread across the cloud in Germany or wherever. But going forward, I don't think that will be the case. I think everybody will want local data.
Sorry, Fergus.
Yeah, John, perhaps I can come back on one thing which does lead me to quite a bit of concern. I think that there are two elements to the process of the UK leaving the EU. There's the process of leaving the customs union, and that's the big impact that we've seen at the moment. And that means that we've got checks at the border. That means that you've got rules of origin calculations. I'm sure I've spoken to people in this room about that very issue. And those are a significant challenge when you start the process. But you start to build them in, and they're relatively stable. And if you can make your business model work with the additional cost, and as Andrew said, the additional time, then it's okay, then it's manageable. And that's one part of it. The other part of it, which probably really hasn't had a full impact, or we haven't seen the full impact, is leaving the single market. And this is where we had a common legislative environment. So the products that we made, if they were compliant for the UK market, they were compliant for the whole of the EU market. And that's still true today, broadly speaking. There are a few exceptions because the legislative environment is the same in the UK as it is in the EU. I'm sure there'll be many people in this room who are dealing with things around labelling and some of the issues around that. Yes, that's a challenge. And yes, testing, etc. Those are things which are going to add cost to business, and you do have to look at the competitiveness of that as an issue. But what I'm more worried about is what happens in 2 years' time, 4 years' time, 6 years' time, when the legislative environment starts to drift. Then actually, are you in a situation where you have to make two different products for those markets because they're so fundamentally different? So I think that's one thing that we need to monitor, manage, and it's something that we'll certainly be keeping an eye on. But we've had one part of the process, which is leaving the customs union. The other part is the leaving the single market, and we haven't seen the true impact of that just yet.
Yeah, I write about this an awful lot on kind of blogs and articles and things like that. This is actually intriguing because there isn't really a cigarette paper between our standards and everything at the moment. But for some people, the benefit of Brexit is to change our standards. Manufacturers don't necessarily, I'll take the opinion of the room, they don't necessarily want to change because, as you're right, it means running two production lines, which makes things even more complicated. David, do you have an opinion on this? I mean, you could actually end up making two different cars. You could end up making a car which is safe to sell in the UK and one that's safe to sell in the rest of the EU if they diverges.
I mean, to me, it's a slightly different angle from my perspective because my expertise is in IT and digital, right? And if ever there was a time to use digital technology to be easy to do business with, it's right now and going forward to me, both at home and globally. As we settle down on standards, hopefully settle down on standards, you would hope there would be some synchronisation there between the gap between those standards. I mean, in our case, it's probably more around the use of hazardous chemicals, for instance. As which is REACH, which the UK has set up its own version of, exactly.
By basically copying and pasting the European one.
So it'd be interesting to see how whether
it diverges or not afterwards. Okay, we might be getting slightly off topic actually because we're supposed to be talking about global supply changes, but actually, just one final thing is anybody thinking about using free ports to get around some of this problem? That actually you don't have border controls so much; you can just bring stuff in, manufacture, and send it out again. Did that appeal to you, David? Did you ever think of doing that?
Absolutely. So we're building the gigafactory on one of historically the greatest ports of Blyth, right? When the day when those who don't know, the site we're building the gigaplant on is an old Victorian coal-fired power station. Right? So how things turn around. And we're actually building it on on what was the coal yard. So there's a deep port, and sure, yeah, absolutely. I think it has a part to play, definitely.
Lewis?
I mean, I think the position on free ports is it's important to accept that free ports have a role to play, particularly in looking at things like levelling up and regional development. And they absolutely have a role to play in how you construct an industrial strategy to support particular areas. But they aren't a panacea for customs and trade, particularly not with the EU. Because the fundamental bottom line with that is that anything which is produced in a free port will not be tariff-free into the EU. They are exempt and they are outside the scope of the deal which the UK has struck. So I think free ports definitely need to be explored, but they aren't the solution to the disruption in trade that we've seen. They may well, in a new world, in a world where we're developing new technologies and we're looking at different markets, have a huge role to play in the UK's industrial strategy, but they're not an answer to the change in trade that we've had.
Yeah, and to be fair, the OBR itself points out, the Office for Budget Responsibility, which checks the Treasurer's figures, basically says free ports don't make any difference to the economy overall. They just move economic activity around. I've got a question here for you, Andrew. I suppose it's for you because I don't understand it. Do you think that investing in digitalization is a solution to the challenges in the supply chain? And what's the biggest problem that we can solve with software?
Can I understand it?
Yeah, the answer is yes, I think.
I
isn't
understand it. Look, I work for a technology company, so of course part of my answer is going to be yes. But equally, I try to represent manufacturers and what I hear from our customers. So I'd like to caveat it by saying it's only one of the ways in which supply chains can improve themselves. I think you heard some very good ones this morning from the keynote speakers around the physical changes in supply chain that need to happen. And actually those are some of the conversations we have with our manufacturers, because when they make those changes, they have to then embody those changes in their supply chain model as well. But if you're thinking about technology as a change, I think that in the last decade, there has been a kind of a development of cloud-based supply chain software which make it easier to have much greater visibility across your supply chain than you've ever had before. Technologies that I didn't have when I was in manufacturing, but are available to manufacturers now.
Sorry, what do you mean when you say visibility?
Well, your report does show, because one of the questions we asked is, how much visibility do you really have of your supply chain? And I won't give the figure, but a large percentage, or shall I?
Oh, happy to.
50% said we only really get one up, one down. So in other words, we get half, we can see a customer and we can see a supplier, and that's it. Now the leaders were at least 2 up, 2 down. And when we look at supply chains with cloud-based software, we're looking at N up, N down. In other words, everybody who shows willingness and is onboarded into the supply chain has basically perfect visibility of what's going on through all layers of supply chain. And that's what you mean by cloud-based software. You're not EDI messaging one another, you're not emailing one another, you're not telephone people. You're basically putting your order status in the cloud, and anybody who has permissions and authorization to look at that order status instantly see a change. Now, if you think for yourselves how many changes take place to your orders per day, you imagine that extrapolated across the entire ecosystem, you suddenly see, wow, that's a lot of changes. And to have that sort of visibility really dramatically helps. And then, you layer in that with the fact that, intelligent software these days is allowed to drive predictability. We do some amazing things, like, we probably know better than the ports what the dwell time is going to be in Rotterdam when a boat's on its way. Why? Because we can see every single boat going into Rotterdam, and predictably we can say, oh, it's normally 2.5 days, it's going to be 3.5 days. Our customers then know that, and they organise their onward freight accordingly. So it's this combination of visibility, data and intelligence that allow you to do some pretty sharp things around advanced things really around supply chains, and that's what builds resilience.
So, David, your example, you go to the Congo to check where the actual metal, that is going right down the supply chain a very long way, isn't it?
Completely.
Right to the very beginning.
Completely, yeah. I mean, I think the utopian, just to build on Andrew's point there, I mean, the utopian model there is to have complete visibility in the truest sense. And we talk about our products going from cradle to cradle. Because it's not just when you kind of produce the product and it goes to the customer. What happens when we recycle? What about happens to the material that we recycle, and where does that go? So I think absolutely it's a matter of data. It's a matter of I think it's the digital technology you're talking around. I really do believe is an enabler for those strategic relationships. We want our we want to give visibility around our full manufacturing process and our supply to our customers. As we get into a world where more and more products, certainly premium products, are built to order, in effect, right? It's really key that those messages are flagged early and everybody is on the same page. There's no surprises, even to the end consumer, even. That's applicable.
Actually, I'll come to you just 1 second, sir, and I just wanted to ask something about options that companies have when their supply chains break down are not just finding new suppliers or making it work. You can design components out. You can find replacement materials. You can redesign stuff. Andrew, lots of companies must be working that way to solve this problem rather than just trying to make the shipping work better or whatever.
Yeah, there's immediate and then there's long term. So immediate supply chains, what you're really looking for there is first you just want to interrogate what the problem is. Is it that flight didn't come in on time, procurement was late, I don't know, inventory was wrong, any of those sorts of things. And software is pretty good these days at assessing what's the impact of that on your business, and then giving you recommendations as to how you change it pretty quickly. Now, but that's just dealing with what you can choose today. And I think what other companies do when they say they're doing supply chain visibility is they're looking at the critical parts analysis and they're deciding what needs to be designed out. So I have one interesting story from a company some time since. It was let's just say it was an aerospace company, and titanium was one of their because of its lightness and strength. And when they did the critical parts analysis right the way down to how much titanium is there in the world, where does it get processed, etc., they found that they were in competition with golf club manufacturers. So who would have thought that a manufacturer in aerospace was actually competing for capacity on a critical resource with a golf club manufacturer? So you're using technology to go all the way down there. And then what do you do about it at that point? I mean, your options are
go to the golf shop and buy some irons.
Yeah, and start smelting. Yeah, contract it out or design it out. Those are the only two things, and so that takes you down another completely different avenue. But yeah, once the problem is sort of made visible to you, then at least the engineers can get to work on deciding what do we do next.
We do tend to think of those kind of things in, economic history is one of my big things. So things like product shortages caused by war.
Yeah.
Companies and countries have had no choice but to find alternatives very, very quickly and design them into their systems. This, you're talking about trying to find a replacement for titanium for the aircraft industry.
It's not always easy, but then it's not easy for doing with batteries. But what's the story on lithium at the moment that Tesla are trying to looking at?
Yeah, well, it was announced. Tesla, our friends at Tesla, announced that they were reinvesting in called lithium iron phosphate, which is quite an old technology for batteries, right? And it doesn't perform as well as other products, but they and that was a reaction to. If a product is difficult to source, expensive, and is not sustainable, then what can we do about it? You either you suck it up, right? You don't supply, or you redesign your products, and we're seeing that all the way through the industry. It's such a rapidly changing market, and I think. I truly believe that this period we're going through now there will be some fantastic innovation coming out of this. We've seen it before, right? With world wars and depressions, we always get innovation, and I think we're seeing the genesis of a lot of that right now.
I think that's one of the things William Hague said, isn't it?
I just thought two more examples might be interesting for the audience. So one's a famous one that you may have heard of. Apple, when they introduced the iPod. Why did it take so long for the competition to fight back? Was it because it was difficult to do a solid state recorder? Well, it was relatively straightforward and easy. It was copied instantly. But there was no capacity left on solid-state drives because Apple had actually anticipated what the demand was going to be and procured most of the capacity in the world. So it made it really, really difficult for our competitor to fight back. So one of them is procurement.
Is that legal?
Absolutely it is, yeah. They just, nobody else was needing it at the time, so they went and placed their contracts. That's a kind of a famous case study. And the other one, which is a bit more recent times, again, some people will have read this, vertical supply chain. So again, I said about a year ago, I had that round table and you could sense the automotive industry getting really, really frustrated about this chip shortage business. And you just thought, I know what the automotive company is going to do. What the automotive company always does, it goes vertical. And sure enough, within, I don't know, was it last September? Was it GM that announced, right, we're building chips? Yeah. And so that's the other way that large companies go. They basically own the problem and go for vertical integration.
Okay. I'll just say I once went to a Ford plant in Detroit, which is now about a tenth of its original size, because it did used to start out as a kind of a railhead where the coal and the steel arrived, and they made their own steel, and then they made their own components, and then they made and the rubber. They did everything, and that stopped. But there is a pressure now to restart that. So you've been very patient. Sorry.
So I just wanted to work out how accessible is that technology to the SME markets? Because I can imagine if you're a big player, excuse me, you can have access to your whole supply chain right down to the raw materials from being pulled out of the ground. But if you're an SME drawing on commodities where in actual fact your overall spend doesn't even register on the manufacturers, how do you then use that technology to be able to work out the front end supply chain? And exactly the same with the freight is, although you may not have access to the freight forwarders, they're going to be part of a bigger selection. You've got that data effectively available because of the combined power of all the customers. Is that something that then becomes available for other companies and other countries?
Yeah, the way it typically works is the biggest investment is typically done by the supply chain brand leader. So that could be, in the fashion world, it would be a Nike or an Adidas. In the, in the equipment world, it might be a Caterpillar or a HP. But it's no use unless the entire supply chain gets involved. So where the SMEs get involved is they're typically asked to onboard. Now, the onboarding costs are really, really small and really, really quick. But here's the thing. Once you're onboarded, that cost has gone forever. You can now see anybody else's demand that's on the same network. So if you are supplying Caterpillar and HP for whatever reason, then there's no additional cost to anybody to actually see the demand because it's just permissions based. So it's unlikely that an SME would start it, but an SME will be part of it because you'll be caught up in somebody else's ecosystem. Does that help?
Yeah, no, it does, yeah.
Can I just one thing? I think there's a role here for companies and certainly for industry and government to work together collectively, because this is a challenge, I think, which many businesses are going to come to face more and more. And I think that there is a job for us to do in terms of essentially sitting down and identifying challenges, identifying weaknesses, identifying supply chain challenges. And the benefit that we have at the moment is that we've just gone through the largest bottom-up assessment of our trading relationships that we have ever gone through. We've gone through a process of understanding what we sell, to whom we sell it and where we sell it, and we're starting to collect that information in a way that we never did, certainly for our nearest market in the EU, but more broadly we're starting to do that as well. And it's fascinating talking to teams in government who are negotiating at the moment new trade deals, and the level of detailed knowledge they have about what we sell and who we sell it to is incredible at the moment. And I think there's a job for us to work with government to try and unleash the value of that data and understand, can we create early warning systems? Was the shortage in semiconductors, in microchips, predictable? And if it was predictable, how do we predict the next shortage? How do we work collectively to understand what is going to be an impact? And you've seen that at the moment through the work that the Department for International Trade have been doing in terms of the sanctions on Russia and because of the Ukraine conflict. They know where they are hitting the Russian economy because they have the data which shows what we trade with them. So I think there is actually a role for us to play with government in creating early warning systems, in creating a supply chain resilience task force that can be for the benefit of us understanding collectively what is the next challenge, what is the thing which we collectively as the UK need to be aware of. Are we okay? Is there an issue? Because industry will know that sometimes before government, but collectively government has the resource to manage that at a global view.
I think it's changed the conversation. It's changed the conversation around what do we feel we can share. I mean, this whole thing about supply chain integration is a bit of a misnomer, right? Because no company actually opens up the data for anybody to just join it. But what we do want to do is we want to talk about alerting when something happens or something untoward happens or something doesn't, falls outside a parameter. The rest of the supply chain need to know about it.
That's the key thing, how quickly you can pass
Completely.
that.
Yeah. So it's definitely changed the conversation, regardless of the size of your company, right? If it might be a small company, but be a niche.
It creates a problem because it's the time lag, isn't it? Because being warned about it creates a protectivism, which is that, okay, well, let's go and buy more.
Yeah.
Because we can see it's becoming scarce. I think where government needs to step in is that what are the mitigations? Where's the investment? Where's the infrastructure that needs to be put in place to support it if that's a long-term trend? Otherwise, all we do is we're all fighting for the same scarce resources.
Yeah.
Yeah, it kind of ties in with the question that somebody sent in, which is nobody saw the shortage in chips coming, but what's the next one that we don't know about? Which is an impossible question to answer, really. But is there some vital component out there that we should all be really worried about if it stops arriving from China or Japan or whatever?
I think there's a live problem at the moment, which is energy. I mean, energy right now is probably the thing which is the next chips, because it's an internationally traded commodity. It's a thing which keeps our businesses going. And right now, for me, it feels that is the next scarcity. And it feels about how do we actually manage that? And how do we build a system which is resilient enough that we aren't beholden to either bad actors in the market, but also increasingly volatile environmental events, which means that area. So I would argue that we're starting to see one of those next issues right now.
David, a question that came in actually is quite pertinent at the moment with the inflation that we have at the moment. Is there any sign or information on what the costs are of reshoring or nearshoring? Because the reason everybody outsourced to China was it was cheaper, and we had a very long period of low inflation and lots of new products.
I think in terms of the end product, in terms of the end car, are you talking about, or is that wherever the question came from?
It's online, but I would say the end product. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think I think inevitably there'll be like a lot of trending changes. There may be some short-term impact, but the products we're designing will go into cars that are being produced from 2027 onwards, and also our first tranche of customers are around high-performance vehicles, because to that point we didn't want to compete with the Chinese kind of here's 3 sizes of battery, build your car around that. So we're working with Aston Martin and Lotus, the two that we can talk around, to build high performance vehicles, and that pushes the technology, that pushes the innovation, and that will feed back into then the mainstream, which will hopefully through product development, I believe within 10 years get the vehicles down, and it's mass demand, the way things are going. So.
Fergus, I assume there is a kind of short-term cost of reshoring or nearshoring or whatever, isn't there?
I mean, I suspect there is, but I mean, interestingly, listening to Andrew Neil's keynote speech earlier today, that the labour costs in China are actually vastly increasing at the moment. There's increasing pressure. So the cost balance certainly between markets where we've traditionally offshored for cost are actually starting to draw much tighter. And it gets back to that issue that Andrew, I think, was talking about, which is, yes, you can drive efficiency and cost in your supply chain, but is actually the nearshoring or even the friendshoring, and the concept where working with like-minded countries around the world to secure that, to create that joint resilience on some issues, is that actually much more valuable to you today than the slight cost difference that creates a greater risk later on. So I think that, yes, you're starting to see a closing of the gap in terms of the cost benefit of offshoring to far markets, which means that nearshoring becomes more competitive. But also you're starting to see a different value judgment on actually risk mitigation versus cost.
So it's come down to, was it just in case instead of just in time? Is that basically what it is?
Yeah, I mean, one of the industries we look at is fashion. I mean, so have they, kind of started moving? There's maybe people in the audience in this industry, but they've moved from China to other places in Asia, and again, we see that in terms of where the demand comes from. But the other area that we've said is those people are doing, I would say, large-scale movement of product around the world. I mean, we've all talked about chips, no one's talked about bicycles yet. Has anybody tried to buy a bicycle in the past 18 months? It's blooming hard. And bicycles was one of those where we could see, because we've got a couple of bicycle manufacturers in the customer base, we could see that moving frames around just became ridiculously expensive because there's only so many frames you can get into a crate, and the crate costs going up 3 times, 4 times meant that it was just becoming unpractical. So nearshoring became a better option for that particular manufacturer, simply because the costs, the savings they were making were outweighed by the cost of the transport. Plus, I'll come back to what I said earlier on. All those things work in a period of predictability. If your demand is volatile, they don't work. By the time 12 weeks has come along on the market and the demand has completely changed, you've either stuck with the inventory or you don't have the inventory. There's the only 2 options left. So volatility is not great for that strategy.
Thank you. Certainly.
Thank you. Paul McComb, Director of UK Exports at Department for International Trade. And I want to talk about data, but just on your sort of final sort of points you were discussing around, manufacturing in China, people bringing it closer to home. I came back from China about a year ago. I'd spent 4 years there. And the thing that struck most businesses that came out was, number one, how many of the industries don't rely on labour. The investment in advanced manufacturing to overcome labour costs, they're moving up the value chain and they don't want, frankly, the cheap jobs. So I think what that opened people's eyes on, particularly if you're a big enough customer of those businesses, is I can do this closer to home. So I think, we certainly saw businesses that you won't have heard of in China being moved to the UK, being moved to Europe by the big purchasers in the UK and Europe, because they had the clout to say, bring it over. And we'd help them do that. But to your point on data, and Fergus has mentioned, particularly in the context of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, he's absolutely right. We have the data, we can see who's manufacturing pretty much down to a very a fine level of detail, what's coming in, what the pattern is, etc., etc. That information is your information. You're sending it to government, into HMRC generally. Department for International Trade got access to that data last year through the Trade Act. We're now putting it to some effect to sort of deal with some of these challenges. But it did strike me that if you look at in sort of retail lending, the world of the Experians, the Equifaxes, ClearScores, all these companies have grown up because all the providers share the data amongst themselves. And the model then is not sharing the data back, but yes, no decisions, or the risk is too high for your criteria. It does strike me, I mean, you could come to government and spend a very long time convincing HMRC to open the books. Good luck. It might actually be something for industry to share amongst itself. And for new businesses, they talked this morning about innovation coming out of this difficulty. But all the data that government has on imports and exports comes from everyone in this room. So if you share it more in some way, then actually you all get the value of that sharing.
Okay, well, Andrew, what's the likelihood of persuading these people to share their information rather than the government making them share it?
I'm going to tee you up here in a minute. Passport. You want to talk about passport in a minute? For the military. The biggest challenge to efficient supply chains when they're running globally is actually the willingness to share the data. So in all the examples I've given you so far, it's because the community have benefited from the visibility that you give. When we do an implementation, I don't know what percentage is, let me make it up. Maybe half of the effort is actually in working with the trading partners to figure out what's acceptable to share. And so I said, you can put the object in the cloud and effectively anybody could see it. Well, you can't because you control the permissions. So therefore you agree with your trading partners what you're going to share. So on my example of fashion, and it's true, Adidas and Nike are both customers, guess what? They come down to a common set of sole or rubber. So they will see demand for both because they have to. But that's because permissions are accepted to be able to do that. Free sharing of data is not yet happening. Now, where it affects us the most is actually not in the order demand situation, because like I said, there's a shared common benefit for doing that, so they'll do it. It's in things like traceability for rules of origin, where you're still really looking for true standards to establish themselves. Now, we're starting to see it, and that's why I'm going to ask David in a minute to talk about the battery passport. You're starting to see it in some industries where they'll start up a community because there's a shared interest in having that traceability right the way from the source of the raw material to the end, and particularly around recycling. But again, it has to be because there is a shared common financial gain. So yeah, it's still a problem. It's not exactly free to share the information yet.
David.
Yeah, I mean, I think the traceability topic is a really interesting one, and yes, we are looking to develop a passport battery. If you remember, at the end of foot and mouth, when all cattle had to have a passport to show where they're moving, what happens to them, what they're fed, it's exactly the same principle. As I know you kind of touched on it earlier around carbon reporting, but exactly the same challenges come into carbon reporting. It's only as good as the amount of data that you have, the completeness of your data set. So there's a lot of things generating the battery passport, and it means different things to different people. But certainly tracing what happens to the cell when they go in the car, but even how are those cells performing in the real world? Do they perform as well as we thought they were going to do in the lab? But then interesting as well, the carbon overhead reporting of each cell is extremely important and will become more and more important to EV vehicle manufacturers. I mean, apart from anything else, there's quite a significant decline in Her Majesty's Customs and Excise collecting tax based on emissions, right? Because electric vehicles don't emit that much, right? So there's going to have to be a real change in the way the government collect taxes, and my bet is it's going to be on carbon overhead, right? So what's the carbon level of that car? So we have to be able to prove that, right? So that data is really key, as well as our ESG reporting, of course. And we're reporting carbon around, the actual carbon overhead of the factory that is being constructed, including how are contractors coming to site, what are they driving in, if at all. So all that information will have to be consolidated within what we're calling the battery passport. So it's fascinating, and that will be shared.
Excellent. Fergus, you wanted to...
Just to say, I think it's coming. I think the pressure from governments around the world in terms of greater visibility through supply chains will come. I think we've talked a little bit about rules of origin today, which clearly has been a driver for a lot of people to look at their supply chains, and what we saw from the evidence was that has been a driver for change. So people have reviewed their supply chains because of the drive that rules of origin have pushed them to do that. But you've seen a lot of things. David's just mentioned the carbon border adjustment mechanism. That is something which is coming, certainly for those who are trading into Europe. That will require an understanding of your supply chain. At the moment, it's base input, so raw material predominantly. It will be more complex products in the future. There are other initiatives such as due diligence reporting. And it strikes me that we're in the same sort of territory as we were with the REACH legislation, which has been referred to already, which was originally targeted at large companies, but ended up actually being something that was a huge amount of pressure down the supply chain. And I think things like due diligence reporting will mean that that pressure will be pushed down supply chains, and your customers are going to ask you more questions about where things come from in the future, because they're going to be asked by governments about that.
Yeah, absolutely. There was one question here which we'll have to end on. I think that's our final. Do you have a microphone, sir?
I don't.
Oh, you're a big lad. Keep talking. Yeah.
So mine's about supplier capability, and what we need to do sort of within the UK. So I'm Mark Coffey, I'm from WMG, University of Warwick. So we deal a lot with supply chains and things like that. And one of the things that the UK really needs to sort of work on is actually increasing its supplier capability. In other words, we can't make a whole thing. So we have a lot of people who want to manufacture in the United Kingdom, and then they turn around and say, well, I can't find someone who can do X, or I can't find someone who can do Y. Taking your bicycle frame things like testing, we've got quite a lot of bicycles made in sort of country and everything like that, and they have to send them out to Germany and Spain to have the frames tested.
Yes.
So what are we doing about increasing the capability? I know part of that's skills, but that people want capital equipment and all the rest of it. So what are we going to be doing to actually help that along?
Well, one of the few things I do know is that foreign investment has traditionally really helped the supply chain because they demand very good suppliers in the country. But that's not, foreign direct investment is actually falling, or has fallen back quite a lot. So what can we do about this?
I mean, I think this gets to part of the fundamental question of, how are we going to establish an economic strategy and an industrial strategy in the UK, and what is it that we're going to actually invest in, and how we do that. I think one thing, and you've heard it as a key theme throughout today in many of the speeches, which is around the skills agenda. And I think there's a huge issue there that we do need to definitely address. And that came out in the data. Part of the challenge of transition, part of the challenge in taking supply chain management from where it is today was a skills challenge within companies, particularly focused on SMEs, but not uniquely. So there's a skills issue here across many of these issues. But there's also a question about globally, the models that we have traditionally looked at are regional specialization. So in the example you gave of making a bike frame in the UK but having it tested in Germany, well, up until 2.5 years ago, that wasn't a challenge. It is a challenge today. And we're starting to see that actually we've got lots of these issues which are building up. Strategically, what does it make sense for us to do? Maybe actually the answer to that question is, yes, it's more complex, but sending the bike to Germany is the best solution for today, and actually creating a parallel system in the UK is only going to add additional cost. And if you've got that issue of divergence in legislation, does that make sense? Because you're going to have to send your bike to Germany to get it approved for the EU market anyway. So there's sort of long-term issues that we do need to address, but I think that comes hand in hand with a developed industrial strategy that really decides what is the direction that we want to take the economy. And that feeds into the regulation question. Intrinsically, I don't think anyone is against making regulation better, and I don't think anyone is going to stand up here and say that European legislation should be adopted whole scale because they do it brilliantly. What we need to decide is what is in the best interests of us, long-term strategy and industrial strategy, and what is the legislative environment we need to get us there. Okay. Part of that is skills as well. Sorry.
Thank you very much, Fergus. I know you all want to come in, but you can't. We've run out of time. If you want to do this again, we start again in 5 minutes. So we'll start with that bit. Okay, but thank you all very much, and join me in thanking the panel, Andrew, Fergus, and David.